there are theories of management that say that a direct manager in an organization can really only effectively know and keep track of like 10 people. That's like the upper limit,
Mm-hmm.
because they more than that, and they lose track of the degree of connection relationship that's required to be effective and to actually have a clear mental image of each of those people, each of those
Mm-hmm.
subordinates, or people that are being supervised. And so, so inevitably, when you go above that, um, you go up levels of management. You have, let's say a 10, let's say an order of magnitude increase. So somebody who's a line manager or supervising 10 people that are doing something, they have a good idea of what those people are doing. That person's manager has 10
Yeah.
people who are managing 10 people each. So suddenly, that next level of management has no idea what those 100 people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And they become objects, they become abstractions,
Mm-hmm.
they
Mm-hmm.
become they become tools, means to an
Spreadsheet.
end. They become things on a spreadsheet. It's like, well, this department has got these people and they're supposed to be doing this. They're, that's their job as a manager. And as you go up the chain of management level, um, eventually you get to the penthouse and you look down on you look 40 stories down at the street, and you can't tell whether they're people or ants. And so that level of abstraction brings with it certain inherent problems, whether and in any system of that degree of hierarchy, whether it's feudal, whether it was czarist Russia, where you you had the serfs in the field,
Mm-hmm.
you had the local low level functionary, you had a local duke, you know or wherever you have these levels, it the higher you go, the more abstract the humans and the processes at the lower level become. And um, and you start, and for people at each level, they're telling each other kind of a similar story that's an abstraction. And the longer that bureaucratic system goes, the more entitled and delusional it can become. And
Yeah. Yeah.
typically within that sort of social structure, I mean, one of the things that happens at the highest level, very high level of hierarchy, let's say Fortune 500 companies, internet multinational corporations, the number of people that sit on the boards of directors, there's people that sit on multiple boards of directors of corporations. Um, they all know. I mean, they know each other. They live in these same rarefied environments. They private jets. They're doing all this stuff. Their children marry each other. One of their children is not going to marry somebody from an assembly line,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how Romeo and Juliet it may be. First of all, they probably never encounter each other,
Yeah.
except
Yeah.
maybe. Um, and so, like George Carlin was fond of saying, is you don't have to have a conspiracy when people's interests converge.
Mm. Yeah.
They don't have to actually communicate specifically. they know what's good for them.
Yeah. And then they call this is conspiracy.
Yeah, right.
But it's like a
Um,
basic interest.
it's basically, mutual interest, and they don't have exposure to other modes of living.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I go back to a lot. There was actually an event in U.S. history when I was young during the Vietnam War. In 1968, we had a Democratic convention take place in Chicago that turned
What
very
what
violent.
what is convention?
Oh, it was the Democratic nominating process. There have been primary elections
Mm-hmm.
for selecting, for competing candidates for president, and then
Representatives, right?
yeah, in different states,
Yeah, yeah.
because our election process is kind of unique in the world,
Republic.
and yeah, this republic thing, but all these different states have got a certain degree of autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
and so you have these primary elections, they call them, where candidates for office, for national office, um, have to go and compete, and it's a long process. I mean, it takes a year,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to go and try and convince Iowa voters that they're the best. They have to go to Vermont, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
California. There are these individual elections, pre-elections, if you
Mm-hmm.
will, and depending upon how a presidential candidate does in one state, what they're, you know, and it's mainly the people who are active in a political party who participate in this, the people who are interested in that party. So then after a bunch of these different elections have taken place, there are delegates for the particular party that have been selected to represent the interests of that state, Democratic Party or Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And then they all gather the summer before they come together for a big event that would be like the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention. And they spend, a week together,
Mm-hmm.
and they come, and supposedly there's speeches and there's more representation of the different candidates, there's lobbying, there's all kinds of things that happen. And then the representatives of that state, they determine, and then they vote and select the actual presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate at those events, at those conventions. And it's a big show. I mean, it's a big, long, elaborate process. And um, there could be a whole nother argument about whether it ever worked very well
Mm-hmm.
and whether it works at all now to the benefit of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a different conversation. But what happened in 1968 during the anti-Vietnam War movement was very, very active in the country,
Mm-hmm.
and they had this convention in Chicago, and there were like eight different student activist organizations in the country that were against the war,
Mm-hmm.
and but they were very different from each other. One was the Black Panthers. Um, there were there were these different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They all came to Chicago and were demonstrating in their own way,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them didn't like each other because they were like Trotskyites and Leninists. You know, they were they were kind of revolutionary, but they had very different points of view, and they didn't like
Mm-hmm.
each other. And the so there was a lot of violence, and the Chicago Police Department under Mayor Daley were really, really. There was tear gas, there was beatings, there was lots of oppression of these
Mm-hmm.
the National Guard came in. It was a very violent confrontation in Chicago for a number of days. So the U.S. federal government, the Justice Department under Richard Nixon, decided they were going to prosecute the leadership of these different organizations, and they charged them with conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
But they had never communicated with each other
Mm-hmm.
other than hostilely. But this was in like 1969, and in order to prosecute these people for conspiracy, they had to change the definition of conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, under the Nixon Justice Department, they prosecuted these people for conspiracy by changing the definition of a conspiracy to being of like mind.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than to have actually actively communicated and colluded and planned together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was such an interesting, you've heard the term confession by projection. Have you ever heard that?
I think I understand it. So they're the judge, right? Like.
Well, no. When somebody points their finger and says those people are doing this
Mm-hmm.
and they're bad,
Mm-hmm.
very often someone is projecting
Oh,
their
okay,
own
okay,
shadow.
yeah.
They're
It's like,
accusing someone else of what they're doing
yeah,
in
because
order to, yeah, look over there, don't look at me.
if you're not doing it, you can't see it.
Right.
You know, it's like we
Yeah.
have like
Yeah.
a fisher sees a fisher from like long distance, kind of,
Mhm.
or like you can see the cheater or somebody if you're a cheater yourself.
Mhm.
Because in other
Mhm.
way you're not abstracted, not you can't like see
Right.
it in
You
territory.
can't.
You can't
Yeah.
map it.
You can't recognize the pattern.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Unless you've been in the same. Yeah. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court. They were convicted, actually,
Mm-hmm.
under this new definition, and the Supreme Court overturned it. It says no, you can't change the definition of conspiracy to being of like mind because that's, you know. But basically, that is, I mean, that was George Carlin's point in the '90s or whatever, arguing about that where interests converge, the cues are exchanged,
Mm-hmm.
the meta communication takes place,
Yeah.
and people know what's good for each. I know what's good for me, what my self interest is, and I can recognize it in you
Mm-hmm.
because we're in the same country club, or we're in the same high end restaurant, or we're in the same environment, and we may compete with each other, but only to a point that doesn't undermine our systemic position.
Yeah, yeah. Not changing the whole like
Right.
contexts,
Yeah.
playground.